transport modeling, where you have very strongly nonlinear sorption and the possibility of solute remobilization. And I've chosen to focus on ion exchange because that's about as nonlinear as it gets. And also this whole problem of remobilization, it goes to the core of what you consider to be conservative and non-conservative in the safety assessment. So sometimes it's quite important to be able to know what these choices mean, the changes in physicochemical conditions which result in something that is previously sorbed strongly coming out as a pulse. So the basic idea is, I think I got my timing messed up on this one, but since the reactive transport calculations must be made to demonstrate safety functions related to hydrochemical stability, if you've already done these simulations for hydrochemistry, you really don't need to do them again when you're studying the radionuclide transport. And because reactive transport simulations are very numerically demanding, it would be much faster if you could import this data in some way or even simulate it in a much simplified fashion for use in radionuclide transport calculations. And the simplified modeling approach I use is based upon the premise that if you have a really low concentration of the migrating nuclide, it has effectively no influence on bulk groundwater chemistry. Now, that's not always true. In some situations, particularly redox-sensitive solutes, it may have a strong influence on the redox state of the groundwater, but some solutes you definitely can make this assumption. Then you use FP7-CROCK, some equivalent code, to generate a parametric description of sorption, basically a dynamic KD, or some people call it a smart KD. And that way you're using a mechanistic model to correlate KD against your hydrochemical parameters. And then use the imported hydrochemical simulation data together with the parametric KD to simulate the transport of the nuclides. So I call this the decoupled major ion chemistry approach, and here is just the normal mass balance you would have for rock matrix. On the right-hand side you have the transport terms, diffusion. On the left-hand side you have the accumulation, both in the liquid phase and in the sorbed phase. KD, of course, doesn't tell you anything about mechanisms. It depends how you model it, but basically it is just the ratio of sorbed and dissolved concentrations. And a conditional KD for sorption, one-to-one sorption, where the concentration in the solution always corresponds to a fixed concentration in the solid phase. You can always define it in terms of the groundwater composition. And you can have non-linearity relating to the migrating nuclide itself, which causes saturation of sites. And then you can have non-linearity related to other groundwater components, which involves competition, speciation effects, changes in pH, what have you. So, if you do have a migrating radionuclide that doesn't affect the bulk groundwater chemistry, you can simplify the mass balances quite considerably, and you can split the nonlinear sorption term into a nonlinear accumulation term, which is the intrinsic saturation of sites in the Langmuir context. And you can have a pseudo-reaction term, which explains the nonlinearity relating to evolving groundwater chemistry. So we developed a code called PathTrack, and that was developed to perform simulations based upon this simplification. For the purpose of making demonstration calculations, I focused on the cation exchange model that was produced in the SKB program in '95. It has selectivity coefficients. It's a single-site model. It has selectivity coefficients for all the major groundwater constituents and also for some of the more important trace solutes. Now, in this very, very simple example, I've looked at what happens if you have different groundwater compositions, a saline groundwater and a fresh groundwater. And of course, it's not really as simple as that, but in certain situations you can describe these things in terms of a mixing problem. You mix one groundwater with another, you have a different salinity, and of course, ion exchange is very strongly dependent upon the salinity of ion exchange. So here I've just very simply correlated the KD, or here I've plotted the relative change in KD as a function of mixing fraction spanning fresh groundwater and the saline groundwater. So under the fresh groundwater conditions, for radium, for example, and strontium, you'd expect the KD roughly 100 times greater. On fresh groundwater, the KD would be roughly 100 times greater than in the saline groundwater. So in the simple demonstration case, I've chosen a one-dimensional flow path with matrix diffusion. Took some standard parameters for rock matrix diffusivity, porosity, an F factor. This is the hydrodynamic transport resistance, and that corresponds to a flow path that is quite fast, has relatively weak retention, and an advective travel time of 1 year, and a limited matrix depth of 1 meter. Although that doesn't really matter, you never penetrate that deep into the rock matrix on the time scales that I'm simulating. I've simulated the migration of radium as a constant concentration source term, and then I impose alternating pulses of fresh and saline groundwater as similar to a scenario you might see in a glaciation case where you have turnover of the salinity. Calculate the conditional KD and its rate of change using the parametric KD model, and that's correlated directly with the ionic strength in the mixing model. And then, in order to test this, I also do fully coupled reference simulations using the CrunchFlow program. So here are the results. And you see that with the dynamic KD, you do see the remobilization. It doesn't match exactly the fully coupled solution, but probably a passable approximation. It's certainly better than what you would get if you were to just assume the maximum and minimum constant KD and simulate it that way. So this tells you that at certain times, when you have the sudden transition from fresh dominated conditions in the aquifer to saline conditions, you get a remobilization. The solute sorbs in the rock matrix, but not very deep. And then when the saline water comes, it pushes it off and it goes through. These are the CrunchFlow results. I've plotted some of the other ion exchanges here, rubidium, strontium, cesium as well. They follow a similar pattern with a remobilization spike. The transients are a little bit different in each case. What I think is most interesting, though, is the base cation breakthrough curves. You can see here quite clearly that these transients don't correspond to a mixing model at all. And that's one of the problems associated with using mixing models. You don't capture the chromatographic separation of fronts when you have the turnover from the fresh and saline and back again. So this is obviously something that a mixing model can't capture. So in conclusion, I can say that the path track simulations with this much simplified process description, they're a lot faster. You can do them in about 10 hours. And that's not a very efficiently programmed code either, so I could probably get another order of magnitude on that. The fully coupled calculations, on the other hand, take about 6 days to do. And that's very slow. Pleasure. I think in a PA situation, 6 days is probably longer than what would be acceptable. I don't think even path track code you could really do a lot of probabilistic calculations at this point unless you made it a lot faster. but still a factor of 20 is better than nothing. We believe that the path track results in the present case study differ from the fully coupled solution because the simplified mixing model doesn't capture this chromatographic separation process. But on the other hand, if we were to model surface complexes, I think that may work better in the mixing model approximation because the trends in pH and carbonate concentration won't be subject to the same chromatographic separation. Although I think I'll have to investigate that further. I haven't demonstrated that. But at the end of the day, you might want to lose the mixing models altogether. And if there are hydrochemical simulation data available from other investigations, I know that a lot of effort is going on now to incorporate geochemistry in the form of freak C into the big, complex flow models, one of which SKD uses Connect Flow. And if this data exists, then you could easily import it directly into PathTrack to assign KD values directly for a more sophisticated parametric model. And then you'd avoid these problems altogether with the mixing approximation. So that was my presentation. Thank you.
Question concerning the gradients and dealing with the gradients with my lab.
Yeah.
I tried to do some similar calculations with flex PDE. And of course, this code always runs in problems when the gradients are too steep. How is the performance of the MATLAB in this context?
Yeah, I use the 1D MATLAB function. It's called PDE-PE, which solves the partial differential equation in the one-dimensional case. And then I have a system of daisy chaining them together to simulate an advective flow path with the matrix diffusion. And it seems to work okay. I mean, it is slow, and I think when it is slow, it's because of these gradients. It takes a lot of effort for the solver to calculate. It's quite a stiff problem. Interestingly, I think if you had higher F factors, the F factor I simulated is a very, very low F factor, and it's probably lower than what would be acceptable in a repository environment. But if you have higher F factor, you won't have these sudden transitions from fresh to saline groundwater. You'll have a very mitigated profile of change because before the water even gets to the repository, it's already been through a matrix diffusion process. So I think in reality, I'm imposing extremely strong gradients and provoking nonlinear behavior, which is may not be physically realistic, but the whole point of the exercise was to see if I could model nonlinear behavior. So I basically put this model in a cage and poked it with a stick to see what I can force it to do. But yeah, gradients are a problem.
More questions? You shown the influence of the mixing problem in case the current is changed to dominating sorption process. What would happen if the surface compensation?
Yeah. Well, of course, you have changes in pH and carbonate, which are the main two variables for the surface complexes, if you forget about the redox-sensitive ones. And I think in the work that we've done, particularly looking at the grout degradation and what that does in reactive transport situations. In certain situations, you can model these transients in pH and carbonate with the mixing model, and it agrees very well with the full reactive transport calculations. The assumption, of course, being that whatever minerals are in equilibrium have to exist everywhere along the flow path. But I think the surface complexes, you get similar remobilization, perhaps not as strong as the ion exchange cases, but certainly saline, I think, has a lower pH than the fresh groundwater, and then the fresh groundwater has got more carbonate, so whatever process wins in the speciation versus the surface reactions.
I have some more questions. Somebody? I have one question and then one opinion.
Yeah.
The question is, I don't understand why do you need this mixing model implemented and not, I mean, to solve the advection dispersion equation conservatively is quite cheap,
Yeah.
computationally speaking.
Yeah.
So then you would have a real solution. And
Yeah, absolutely. I could add a second proxy component, which would be a mixing fraction. So basically, I have a nuclide and a proxy component to tell me what the mixing fraction is. That would have been the more obvious choice, actually. I think I started down the road of using the mixing model calculated separately, and I kept it that way. Because this is under development, I haven't had time to implement more.
But what I mean is that this is something relatively easy to do, that you can do, and that would be a major improvement.
Absolutely.
And then an opinion is that we can discuss also later, but we have some time. So is that I think I don't agree with the how to explain that. I mean, the simplification you are doing, I think is very clever. That's for sure. But now, in the 21st century, that the memory and computers are very cheap, these problems with the flow lines are so easy to parallelize. As the computer scientists say, so embarrassingly parallelizable.
Yeah.
So then, I have the feeling that this kind of simplifications, if you want to go to real 3D models, I find it is very interesting. But if you go to flow path approaches, I think it is possible to do with the whole complexity because it's very easy to parallelize. If you go to, but this is just an opinion.
I still think that even if you've got a really fast computer, the reactive transport calculations, they're a lot more demanding than you'd really like them to be. Particularly when you want to improve the resolution of the model. Basically, it's this trade-off with the number of nodes you have and the complexity of chemistry all the time.
I agree, but still, you say 6 for a fully coupled reactive transfer model. Of course, crunch flow 6 days is not really an optimum simulator, But even if you have 1 day of CPU time for each flow line or long-term simulations, the tendency seems that the resources of computational resources are getting really inexpensive. In the sense that you can get now 10,000 processors in Amazon cloud computing center relatively cheap. So in 10 years, it seems that even Google would maybe give you free access for some days. It looks like the tendency is to develop so big machines and put it available to the people that they. Well, the question could be if your simplification, I think, is also applicable to fully 3D problems, and then I think it's a major contribution in general. But if you go to 3D, then you need to be efficient. But if you go to this multiple 1D, of course, if you are efficient, it's much better. But I think it's a second derivative of the problem. It's just an opinion.
I think also there's a certain value in being able to separate sorption chemistry into something that's tangible in terms of you have a parametric KD and then you have the transport equations, because sometimes when you solve these reactive transport problems, lots of weird numerical stuff happens that you're not really sure exactly if it's physically meaningful or not. And I think, for me anyway, being able to separate chemistry and the physics of the transport in this way helps me understand the processes that are going on a little bit better. For sure, I like the full reactive transport simulations because they are physically meaningful. You can see the chromatographic separation of base cations and stuff. And, particularly if you want to add more and more complexities like anion exclusion or perhaps even multi-component diffusion with different diffusivities and diffusion back against ionic gradients and so forth.
mixing, how you deal with that. So is there any check if you have supersaturation or undersaturation versus mineral phases that you that could basically change these steep gradients that you have in the system?
Well, the fundamental assumption is that the nuclide is sufficiently dilute that it doesn't affect the groundwater chemistry, and that also extends to it should be low enough that you don't form a solid phase, because then the KD is meaningless.
No, but for your major cations and anions, that the major cations that you have.
Oh yes, that's included. In the parametric KD, for example, mixing the groundwaters, I assume that if calcite is oversaturated, it will precipitate, or dissolve, as the case may be. And provided everywhere in the system you have the same minerals, for example, and some of them are pretty easy to assume that that is the case, like calcite particularly, also the ferric oxides possibly, and then the mixing calculations, you just very simply include these precipitation dissolution reactions, and the mixing model matches the bulk groundwater chemistry trends mostly.
More questions? I remember that there is some people, we are working in a similar idea, we have been speaking about that, and there is also some other people here in Germany doing very much the same of this parametric or variable KD, and they call it a smart KD.
Yeah.
And there is I think one publication of these people from Rosenthal. So I think there is a few people having similar ideas and developing, because of course I think this is something very interesting for improving the tools of calculations. Okay, so anything else? So what happens?